So after a very interesting presentation, which was a lot more about the pride and the history of India, let me talk to you something about some elements of finance and money, but also talk about how our future is changing and where in the world of finance we are beginning to see concepts like ESG come in. I must say that when I first received the invite for this session, I was somewhat flummoxed as to why such a topic which is reasonably esoteric in the world of finance has found favor here. I understand that at the margin this is beginning to become important as we begin to think about the new sets of investments that India has to do, specifically as we think about climate change. I will talk about the entire gamut of ESG, talk about where ESG stands with respects to either its proponents as well as some detractors, and it's a fantastic day to be doing this with Elon Musk having come out all guns blazing with respect to ESG a couple of days ago, and you will see that in my presentation here. So without further ado, let me proceed ahead and talk to you more about what's happening in this world of finance and how this could potentially impact our futures. So the important point is, and you will find my slides are very wordy, not very pictorial as the previous slides were. I don't want you to focus on the words. The idea is that as we begin to think about what is changing in the world of capitalism per se, in the way the market economy is set up, is the entire idea of moving away from stockholder or shareholder as the primary person that you are trying to maximize for, the management is trying to maximize for, and move that to a stakeholder at the core. Now, there is a big push and movement towards moving from just optimizing for one set of audience, which is the stockholder, largely because there is a growing perception and in some sense a reality that the way the current market capitalism has been structured, this has led to significant amount of inequalities in opportunities, in income, in wealth, etc. And hence just optimizing for one set of stakeholders, if you will, does not cut it. Where does that leave us? That takes us to the idea of stakeholder capitalism. The idea that you are not just thinking about your maximizing returns for your stockholder, but you will take into account just about every stakeholder that you come in association with, which could be your employees, which could be your customers, which could be your suppliers, which will be government, which will be the local society, etc., etc. This is a very complex world. Sometimes in life it is very easy when you have one rule to follow, when you have one thing to optimize for, and as managers it becomes increasingly challenging as to how do you think about distribution between different stakeholders. This distribution needs to also be fair. The definition of fair itself can be very, very challenging. It can be very different for different people, and it is to be fair over a period of time. So there are many variables that you are trying to solve for. Having said that, this is beginning to become an important component of how at least some of the key business leaders across the world are thinking. I think a pivotal moment was the 2019 Business Roundtable when a large number of Fortune 500 CEOs signed up to say that we are committing to the benefit of all stakeholders, and they listed out a bunch of stakeholders, which includes customers, employees, suppliers, communities, shareholders, etc. Now, the idea that instead of just maximizing for the promoter or for the owner, but thinking about running a business more as a trustee is something that in India we have had a history of. There is something that has been discussed. Mahatma Gandhi is famous for talking about the trusteeship model. There are many earlier promoters who have spoken about this idea, and so I think towards the end we'll talk about how we should think about this from an Indian context as to whether this is something which is doable. But I think it leaves us with a very important question as to, one, how does trying to balance everything work, and more important, does this even work? I think it's an important question for us to think about as to whether it is practically possible to meet the stakeholders' needs. In some sense, this is also the beginning of thinking about business almost as a political animal, and you're beginning to see some sort of challenges emerge as businesses weigh in on many of these points. What I will do is I will talk about what E, S, and G mean to give you some sense of where the different set of stakeholders are coming in from, and then let's take things from there. Given that this is not an everyday topic, I am very happy for you to stop me, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to respond to, or if there is anything that you want to talk about, happy to talk about it. The first E in ESG is environment. The idea is that there has been significant man-made climate change that is taking place, which impacts the business, and businesses are also responsible for the climate change, and hence there is a large need to continue to change how our businesses are run, both from the perspective of what is it that they are adding to the environment or taking away from environment, as also the sort of changes that are taking place in environment, how that is impacting the business. So for example, an important thing that we have seen play out over the last couple of months, when after the Russia-Ukraine situation, India expected to send out and export a large amount of wheat. But a sudden change in climate, which the heat wave in March seemed to suggest that India may not produce as much as it was expecting. And to that extent, it impacted the plans of businesses that would have wanted to export out. It also impacts the way India would think about its food security. Now, how much can businesses take this into account, how much of this can be hedged, how much of this can be actually taken forward, are things that we will think about. One of the things that we are beginning to see a lot, and you will see me focus a lot on that, is as investors, and I also represent NIIF, which is the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund. For us, investing in businesses which are ESG compliant is becoming increasingly a priority, and so businesses are also being required to at least take some of these things into account, and you will find both investors as well as businesses talk about these net zero pledges. I'll talk about this technical concept of a net zero as we talk some more about E. The second question that comes in ESG is the whole idea of either social, some also call it sustainability. The idea that as a business, and this goes back to the point about stakeholder capitalism that I was talking about, are you taking care of all? Are you a model corporate citizen? How are your customers? How are your suppliers? How are your employees? Local regulations, etc., etc. Again, this is something that has been around. There was a conversation about CSR that had come through. Even otherwise, there are organizations that think about social responsibility. How do you make it core and in center is something that is now becoming a lot more prevalent. And finally, there is this point about governance, which is to say that in a situation where there is potentially either a minority shareholder or a minority representation, which could potentially be, let's say, a segment of society which is not represented on jobs, that could be gender-based, that could be some other basis. How is the organization dealing with it? Again, now once you begin to get into this domain, this almost is in the realms of politics, which the objective of which is to work through various stakeholders. And I think it's important for us to also understand where this leaves businesses. Given how difficult it is to weave in all of these, we have no surprise that Elon Musk was out all guns blazing a couple of days ago, maybe on 18th, 2-3 days ago, talking about a report that S&P put out, Standard & Poor's put out ranking and talking about which are the companies which are doing most for ESG, and Tesla did not make the list. One of the simple investments for investors like us is to invest in electronic vehicles, anything in that value chain, etc., because the idea and the expectation is that that is reducing the climate impact. Now, S&P had its reasons. It had spoken about worker conditions, racism, etc., etc. But trying to balance this can be an interesting and an important challenge. I think it's also interesting the sort of meme that he put out talking about what it means to have an ESG score, and the idea is that it determines how compliant your business is with the left agenda. I think this is increasingly becoming an important political issue. Any of you who are adventurous enough to follow Elon Musk's Twitter storm, he is in some sense the new Donald Trump. It's just a flurry of tweets after tweets. And he's been talking a lot about how in some sense this has become very, very critical to meet the needs of, in some sense, generation which is very woke. which wants everything right. And that becomes sometimes very difficult. The reason I bring this up is just to talk about the counterpoint that you will see when you talk about ESG. It is important, again, as I said at the start, for investors like ours, for businesses, etc., for us to be at least cognizant with respect to ESG. Now, let me tell you where it also becomes a challenge. And there is an inherent set of contradictions that we find when we see ESG. I've listed out a few, happy to talk more about these again as we speak. Between environment and environment. Now this is something that has happened especially post the Russia-Ukraine situation, where seeing the gas supply and the oil supply from Russia being cut, you're beginning to see the opening up of coal fields, for example, coming back again in mainland Europe. US has seen a significant opening up of its coal and gas fields that it tries to come out of, tries to meet its growing energy demand. Now, if you think about energy security now, the fact that you need to provide energy to your population, your businesses, customers, etc. right now, versus the fact that because you're producing that energy using coal, you may be polluting the environment, and that pollution could eventually lead to a further concentration of greenhouse gases and global warming, etc. How do you balance this? Till before February 24th, the consensus was very clearly in terms of saying that let's go all green. Increasingly, as there has been a supply shock in many of these, you're beginning to see some of these countries come back and talk about how do you begin to provide energy security now, and where is the right balance remains to be seen. With environment and environment is not just climate, and that's a point that we will talk about going forward also. There is an entire element of biodiversity that comes through along with environment. Very famously, the Supreme Court ruled on this, especially in the context of Rajasthan, where there is the great Indian bustard, one of the endangered birds. With respect to a large number of solar park that was being, solar farm that was being set up, how do you lay down the transmission wires such that the great Indian bustard does not either get electrocuted, or in some cases would also come in and hit some of those wires, etc. And with anyway only about 400 such bustards left, how do you ensure that they are taken care of? Now, one option is to ensure that the transmission wires go underneath the ground, and that adds a significant cost to it. Now, how do you think about putting up not coal power plants, you put up solar farms, but then at what price point is it viable for the final customer? Again, something that needs to be thought about. There is something to be said about environment as well as social. One of the newer themes of investment, and again, India's also spoken about its policy of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind production by 2030. These are large wind farms set out sometimes a few kilometers, sometimes many hundreds of kilometers away into the sea. And as some of these farms come up, they tend to disrupt either the local marine life and or the local fishing community. Now, again, as you begin to balance the equation between the communities as well as the energy security needs, there are sometimes setups that you need to do so that the environment assessment is able to move through. An interesting case came up in Serbia, where again, thinking about the entire electronic vehicle value chain, one of the most important components of that is battery, and an important component of battery is lithium. Now, where you mine lithium, you end up polluting that area. Now, is it good for the world? Is it bad for Serbia? What should Serbia do? Should it sacrifice the local problems with respect to the world? Interesting, important challenges. Social and governance, the whole idea of whether you want to take fuel from a country which currently seems to be in the doghouse from a political perspective, or do you want to give the people in your country, especially in Eastern Europe, Mid-Western Europe, sort of cheap fossil fuel? These are all very complex questions. I don't expect to have answers here. I wanted to give you a sense of where things are. And as I said, there are neither easy nor right answers. And what this has done is thrown many people in the business community, in the investment community, especially as ESG starts to become an important component of reporting, of conversations, of even in some cases exclusion, because some investors will not invest in ESG compliant firms, that it has started to become some sort of a challenge for organizations. how do we think about it? What we do is we focus largely and significantly on the environment aspect of it. There is importance on social and governance, which we work on. But what I want to do is spend maybe a few more minutes talking to you about how the environment aspect of ESG stacks up. Now, this is a dense chart, but many of you would have seen this now. Some of these numbers have started to become very popular. There is this number of about 50 to 60 gigatons of carbon equivalent emissions that we do. I'll repeat it. 50 to 60 gigatons. Giga is 10 to the power 9 tons of carbon dioxide that across the world every year we are beginning to put out into the atmosphere. It's gone up from about 40 to close to about 60 now over the course of the last 3 decades or so. There is a natural cycle of Earth to be able to absorb some of this carbon. However, increasingly the scientific consensus is that that cycle seems to be breaking down, and that is continuing to add to the carbon that is there in the atmosphere. Again, some of the numbers that you will hear is that we now are at about 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Every year that we add 50-60 gigatons, we are adding maybe 1 to 2 parts per million every year. The IPCC, which has spoken in length about this, and again, you don't need to read the entire text, their modeling seems to suggest that as we begin to lock ourselves into this 400 plus ppm, we are beginning to lock ourselves into greater than 1.5 degrees of temperature rise compared to the pre-industrial revolution. Now, I've thrown a lot of numbers at you, but I think the practical reality of what we are beginning to see in climate change is because the earth is heating up, you are beginning to see a lot of changes take place either with respect to drier climate, and which is leading to a large number of wildfires, bushfires, etc., or very intense rain cycles, something that we have seen either in the hurricane seasons or even in India, the way monsoon seem to be changing with lesser number of days but higher intensity. So many of those things are changing. Again, the scientific community believes that this is largely driven by the increase in CO2. An important component to remember is that Earth has seen significant amount of changes in CO2 over its entire 4 billion life cycle. The important thing for us is that beyond a certain temperature zone, it becomes impossible for humans to survive. So while Earth will survive, even if the sort of greenhouse effect continues and goes higher, Earth has seen more than 1000 ppm in various parts of its earlier history. It will increasingly become challenging for countries like India, which are in the middle of some of these heat waves and or intense rain days. So it is for humans that I think it is an important component to think about. I'll leave you with one thought on this. Largely, you will find the conversation on ESG's beginning to talk about climate, which is what I have done. Various other elements like biodiversity, etc., are important, but a huge amount of focus is largely on climate, and which is where most of this discussion focuses on. Having said that, I think there is a divergence between how the global world thinks about climate is equal to energy, and how, in some sense, India thinks about climate security versus energy security. If any of you follow the entire sort of diplomatic negotiations at COP26, which is where all the countries catch up every year and talk about their commitments to reducing carbon, India made a specific point about phase down of coal and not phase out of coal, because for us, the low-cost energy security is an important component and will continue to remain an important component. Globally, there is a lot of pressure on countries like India, China, etc., to say that energy security has to be, in some sense, subservient to climate security. That, as we saw, has changed significantly post the Russia-Ukraine situation. So I think the world will reevaluate when it meets again in COP27 in Egypt. Okay. Now, brace for impact. What will this mean? I'll talk about 4 key sectors where this will create changes. These are the 4 key sectors which also contribute the most to the carbon emissions that are coming out into the world. The first, of course, is power, and we've spoken a lot about coal, etc. India Honorable Prime Minister committed to 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030 and 50% of the total energy being generated through renewable sources. This is a very tall ask, and I think indeed a very interesting and an important opportunity for all of us to rise to this occasion. India already has about 150 gigawatts of solar and onshore wind installed, but over the next 7 to 8 years, we will triple the sort of installation that is there, from 150 gigawatts all the way up to 500 gigawatts. These are big opportunities, again, from an investing person also, but clearly from anybody thinking about it, from changes that will come to in businesses and in societies because of this. This is going to be an important component. Corollary of this is going to be significant amount of investments that will come through in storing of power, because a lot of wind and solar by definition gets produced only when the sun is out or when the wind is running. So you will see, and the government is already beginning to bring out the first pilot tenders with respect to either pumped hydro storage, as it is called, or battery storage, where you will be in a position to store some of this energy, which can be then again used for giving back to either consumers or industry, etc., when the sun and the wind is not there. Very interesting set of opportunities opening up here. The important thing to remember is that India produces only about 10 to 11% of its energy needs through renewable sources now. So the sort of mega change that you will see between now and 2030 is quite fantastic, and something that you may want to align yourself with. This is clearly committed by government. You see that in each and every policy pronouncements. So this is a big change that's coming up. Second is transport. Again, a key component of the sort of pollution that happens is through both people transport as well as freight transport. A lot of new technologies are vying in here to see how you can make it less polluting. There will be interesting developments with respect to hydrogen, but till that happens, we are beginning to see significant investments come through in India, at least on two-wheelers and three-wheelers, which are electric in nature. That's something that you will see. The government has also been putting together very favorable policy responses here. There has been a production-linked incentive scheme as well as the FAME scheme, which is moving this transition. I think it may not be a stretch to say that for many of us, if you are using an internal combustion engine car now or a vehicle now, this may be among the last sort of ICE vehicle that you are running. In many parts of the world, this transition has, instead of moving very smoothly, taken a sudden change, as in when infrastructure begins to come in, charging infrastructure comes in, the so-called range anxiety of will I be able to reach far enough with my EV goes away. There is a sudden shift that takes place because fundamentally running an electric vehicle is significantly cheaper compared to running an ICE vehicle. One big change which I think India needs to work on is on the entire field of agriculture. 2-3 big areas, specifically dairy gets called out because of the intense methane production that happens. India again in COP26 did not sign up for the methane convention because methane is, agriculture is an important component of India's livelihood, economy, etc. Having said that, you will see some changes beginning to trickle through on this. Methane is considered to be significantly more impactful with respect to greenhouse gases, its ability to retain the heat and transfer it back to earth. And so to that extent, you will continue to see that. On a very different sense, the sort of climate change point that we spoke about with respect to green will also flow through on agriculture, and the patterns of agriculture will change significantly in India. And finally, you are beginning to see changes take place in what are called hard to abate sectors. Steel, cement, this is where you will see elements like hydrogen, green hydrogen come through. These sectors can also take up the high cost of some of these newer type of technologies because they are slightly less price sensitive. They go into materials which eventually go on to create different types of consumer products, etc., where the ability to take some basic amount of price rise is there. I think in all of this, an important component to think about, and I'll talk about that in the next slide also, is all of these new technologies are good. Can you adopt them at price points which is viable for, let's say, the Indian consumer, which is a very, very price sensitive market? So yes, all of us sitting here should brace for significant change in the pattern of life, the sort of vehicles that we will go in, the sort of power that we will consume, etc., etc. Okay. This is the point about saying that it is sometimes difficult when a new technology comes in for us to think about how we bring it into the ecosystem, how do we mainstream that sort of a technology that comes in. There are three interlocking points that we make here. One is it has to be economically viable for financiers. Investors like ourselves, banks, etc., want the technology to be stable such that it is being used by a large number of people, the rules and regulations around it are stable. Is there predictability in the sort of cash flows that will come through? The people who invest in technologies, people who are investing in thinking about hydrogen, the electrolyzers associated with it, setting up the offshore wind, etc., setting up different types of EVs, different ways in which the solar panels, etc., could move. People who invest in those technologies want appropriate returns. In many cases, these technologies may or may not be based in India and hence come at a significant price point. And finally, you have to offer these to consumers at a price point that they can afford before you end up in a situation where the government is subsidizing many of these. In order to start off a market, as we saw in two-wheelers and three-wheelers in electric or in solar, the government has indeed spent some time and effort in trying to make them more popular, make them more viable. But ensuring that all of these three stakeholders ensure and make money and this sustainably gets into our lifestyle takes a lot of work. Again, for countries like India, I think there is an important and an interesting conversation with respect to something called the Cancun Convention, 2009, when many of these countries met together for one of the COPs. Then the developed world had promised $100 billion support and offered to provide $100 billion a year to developing countries for mitigating all the impact of carbon that is there, that has been created historically in time by the developed world. We haven't seen much of that, and I think a lot of conversation that India has spoken about, India's commitments in COP26 also are in some sense critically dependent on the sort of flow of finance, technology, as well as capacity building that needs to take place here. I think the Honorable Prime Minister also made an important point about $1 trillion of investment that are required over the course of this decade that needs to come through. This is our important slide, which we raise funds. Won't go into a lot of detail, but the point is that as we do some of these transitions, it's not just the private sector which can put in the money. There is a significant role that public institutions need to play. There is an important role that we are now beginning to see a lot of philanthropies beginning to play. Whether these are corporate social responsibility funds that are coming in or some of the larger foundations and family offices that are beginning to come in. On the public side, I think you're also beginning to see many global and multilateral institutions beginning to see a change of their mandate. So with respect to whether it's the World Bank and the IFC, etc., I think there will be increasing pressure on many of these multilateral institutions from their donors and funders, and India happens to be an important donor for some of them, to see how they can leverage their balance sheet and their ability to work across geographies to bring in the sort of technology and finance into India with respect to its green transition. Okay, last couple of points. India has been taking its step with respect to the green transition. We know about the net zero goal by 2070. I'll just spend 1 minute to talk about what net zero means. If you remember the chart that we spoke about of 60 gigatons of carbon that is emitted every year into the atmosphere. If a country is talking about net zero, and a large number of countries now are, the idea is that by whatever date that countries sign up for, US in 2050, China in 2060, India in 2070, this 60 will tend down to zero. Again, if this has to tend down to zero, either the way in which we use power, transport, agriculture, etc., has to materially change, or if some of this still continues to be dependent on carbon, there will be significant use of carbon capture technologies, etc., that will come in. So the idea is that at least as human beings, can we begin to reach a situation where we are not adding more carbon and we end up at the 420, 450 parts per million of carbon that we spoke about. Again, I mentioned the $1 trillion number that was spoken about. Various agencies will look at these hundreds and billions of dollars that need to get invested. So again, anybody looking to make either investments in such businesses, etc., I think this is a fantastic time to think about some of these. I think the location of cities will also alter, as well as the internal composition of cities will alter, especially as we begin to see significant rain-related events. We have had cloud-related events. I come from Mumbai. Of course, 2005 had a very disastrous sort of a cloud burst, but we are now beginning to see that happen more frequently because the intensity of rain is increasing. Friends from Chennai here would know of that. That happens now on a more regular basis. So how cities are structured, how we think about drainage, how we think about where people should be living, etc., will materially alter. So that's something to think about. Well, there you go. So some of those things will also alter where we are living. And thankfully, Bangalore is not on a coast. The big concern with respect to climate change is if there is significant global warming and there is a melting of ice, some of the coastal cities could be in danger. Bombay, Maharashtra and Bombay came out with their plan, and the local government has spoken about net zero by 2050, because at least according to one scenario, 50% of Mumbai could be underwater by 2050, which is like right around the corner if you think about it in human life scale terms. Many regulators are getting into the act. You will see a lot of ups and downs, changes take place here. SEBI is getting into the act, RBI is getting into the act, Ministry of Finance is getting into the act, Ministry of Renewables, Power, etc. So there is a lot of change that you will see come through. That's something that you should be aware of. And again, as I keep saying, coming from an investment hat, if this is an area that you're looking at investing in or starting out on, these seem to be ideas that you want to pursue. One last slide which talks about what we as an organization are doing. NIIF is what we like to call as a sovereign linked asset manager. The government of India is a 49% shareholder as well as capital contributor into NIIF. However, we raise a lot of funds from global sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. And in one of the funds that we have created, it's called the Green Growth Equity Fund. It has now ended up becoming one of the largest single country climate focused fund. This is now a $750 million fund. And it's focusing on many of the things that we spoke about, renewable energy, how we think about waste management, electric mobility. We run one of the largest intercity electric mobility entities, and water treatment. And there are a bunch of other sectors that we are considering investing in. So yes, I started from the entire topic of ESG, but concentrated a lot more on E, which is a lot more actionable from an investment business perspective. Happy to talk about either the contradictions or the sort of things that can be done in ESG. As I said, India is emerging as one of the largest deployers of ESG technologies as well as funds. And India has had a significant history with respect to how to think about ESG in a more holistic sense. That requires some amount of development. I am also proud to say that at NIIF we have just instituted a chair in ESG at IIM Ahmedabad. So again, from an academic perspective, we are beginning to see how we can begin to ease ESG into both investment as well as business. With that, over to you all.